Morning. Margaret Buckley, a prisoner in Mountjoy prison at the birth of this state, wrote, "Have you ever stopped to think what a powerful weapon a key is?" Interesting, I think. You think about it. A country should be judged by the way it treats its most vulnerable people. And I'd just like to ask the question, how does this republic rate when dealing with one cohort of our vulnerable, namely our prisoners? I'm sure everyone in this hall has a preconceived idea of what prison is like. Crime, criminals and prisons are subjects that most of us have strong views on. Our views are tailored, though, by our prejudices. That's fair enough as far as it goes, but what is not as fair is if our prejudices are informed by misinformation or untruths. It's probably fair to say that most people are afraid of people who commit crime. We're afraid that a criminal will injure us, or will damage our property, or will steal our belongings. But that's not a new phenomenon. I suppose if we could banish our criminals, we would be happy. But that's what we did, and we did it for many years after the passing of the Transportation Act in 1818. In fact, between then and the 1850s, we deported about 53,000 of our people to America and Australia. As long as criminals were deported, society felt reasonably safe from these particular people, but deportation did not stop crime, even petty crime. When deportation ceased, we had to look after our own criminals. Now society did not feel as safe, as we could no longer banish our unwanted, therefore proper, secure prisons had to be built. Mountjoy Prison was constructed in 1850 as a model prison. It didn't remain a model prison for very long. It was modelled on the design of Pentonville Prison in England. It had 496 single cells, each with a ceramic flushing toilet and a copper wash-hand basin. The prison also had a complex ventilation system which provided fresh air for each cell and also heating during the cold weather. The flushing toilets and the wash-hand basins were removed in the 1860s. The reason apparently was that it was considered that prisoners, coming as the perception was from the uneducated classes, would not know how to use such modern conveniences. In any event, because of people's impressions of the social standing of prisoners, I'm sure that the removal of flushing toilets and wash-hand basins from Mountjoy Prison in the 1860s did not excite much conversation around dining tables of the leafy suburbs of Dublin. However, the perception that it was only the poor, the uneducated and the destitute that ended up in our prisons was incorrect. If we look at our prisons down through the centuries, we find that academics, poets, freedom fighters, political leaders, trade unionists, suffragettes, reformers, conscientious objectors and many others passed through the gates of our prisons. We inherited many of our prisons from the British. Mountjoy, Portlaoise, Limerick and Cork prisons are in active use today. We did very little with them up to the very recent past. They did not have in-cell sanitation. They were forbidding places, but they served their purpose in that our criminals could be shut away and therefore out of sight and out of mind. But don't forget that others were similarly banished by this, our modern republic. We need only think of our children who were banished to our industrial schools, our young women who ended up in the MacGill laundries, or those who spent much of their lives in our mental hospitals. Society can be judged on how it treats its vulnerable people, and we have, as a society, been judged. Prisoners are vulnerable people, and some are more vulnerable than others. Prisoners are our responsibility, which means they are your responsibility and my responsibility. No one can shy away from the fact, despite the temptation to say that prisoners are the responsibility of the governor. Prisoners are sent to prison in our name. We decide through our elected representatives what penalties are appropriate for the punishment of different types of crimes. When people are sent to prison, the governor, on our behalf, manages these people. We now have 14 prisons in the Irish prison system. One is a dedicated women's prison, one is a young person's prison. We also have 2 open prisons. We've built some new prisons and wings of prisons and have refurbished certain parts of old prisons. At present, there are approximately 4,200 prisoners in our prisons. They are there for a range of crimes, from murder to petty theft, from driving offences to public order offences, and at the lowest end of the spectrum for failing to pay fines. When you read the reports of some trials in our courts and the description of some of the crimes committed, do your prejudices take over, and do you say, there is no punishment that is too harsh for that person? Perhaps you do, and that is a natural reaction. You would probably go further and say, the key must be thrown away. I understand that. What I do not understand are certain elected representatives and certain sections of our popular press making inflammatory statements which feed into our prejudices of what a person convicted by our courts and imprisoned on our behalf should endure in prison. The punishment that people who are sent to prison should have to endure the loss of their freedom and those other rights associated with such loss of freedom. Prisoners are entitled to all other rights such as you and I enjoy. They are entitled to be treated with respect. Because of your prejudices, you may be afraid that you might come across a person who has been discharged from prison, and you might. Very few people die in prison. Therefore, 99.9% of prisoners come out of prison at some stage. What would they be like if we took the view that nothing would be good enough for them in prison, or in other words, they should be treated harshly? Let me say this, and let me say it clearly. I have not found one person who has been improved by prison. On the contrary, all available research shows that most people are damaged in one way or another by prison. Of course, some will gain from vocational training or from certain education. So how should we treat prisoners? What are the rules? I asked the same question when I took up my position as Inspector of Prisons on the 1st of January 2008, having spent the previous 26 years as a judge. I thought there would be a manual. I thought there would be standards against which I could benchmark prisons. But I'm sorry to say that I was disappointed on both fronts. I looked for guidance on what could be considered best international practice, and I found such guidance in the various treaties and international instruments that we as a state are party to. In the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, in the European Prison Rules, in the reports of the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, in the jurisdictions of the courts of other countries, in our Prisons Act of 2007, which says very little, in the Irish Prison Rules of 2007, in the few judgments that there are of our courts, and in our Constitution. I published standards which are all referenced to our obligations just referred to, but then I found that I needed to give further advice on various aspects of my standards. I published reports on such issues as the obligations that we owe to prisoners, the size of cells, the use of safety observation and close supervision cells, how prisoner complaints should be dealt with, how prisoner discipline should be applied, how deaths of prisoners should be investigated, general health issues, the case for dedicated committal areas, and the case for high support units for the most vulnerable. All of these are published and you can find them on my website. Compliance with my standards and with the advice given in my reports is what I expect when I inspect prisons, which I do on a regular basis, mostly unannounced, not alone during the working day, but at night and at weekends. You would be entitled to say, well, now you've published all these standards and reports. Do they make a difference to our prisoners? I think they do. However, while difficult, one can address the physical elements of prison life. What cannot be addressed that easily is fear, uncertainty, and the thoughts that a vulnerable person has when the door bangs at night. Father O'Donnell describes his cell door being closed for the first time on his first day of imprisonment in Mountjoy Prison thus: I was as full of panic as a child who, searching nervously in the distant corner of a barn at night time, is trapped by a gust of wind which slams the door and puts out the candle. It was as bad as that. There have been considerable advances in penal thinking in the last number of years. I would like to think that I have, to some degree, been responsible for part of this changed thinking. We now have a dedicated committal unit in each committal prison. The one in Mountjoy Prison is the model. We have dedicated house support units in Mountjoy and Clover Hill prisons. The one in Mountjoy has been awarded one of its prestigious prizes by the World Health Organization, in addition to other awards. New rules have been laid down for the use of safety observation in close supervision cells. A proper, transparent prisoner complaints procedure has been rolled out, and I have oversight of same. I now investigate all deaths of prisoners. And recently, I published my assessment on where the Irish prison system stands today. I don't want to waste any more time on that, but you can read that assessment again on my website. However, these changes have only been introduced in the past year or so. Reports and dedicated areas will not ensure that human rights of our prisoners are vindicated or that our prisons are run to best international practice. We need external oversight, and that is where I fit into the picture. My job is to hold authority to account. I derive my independence from the Prisons Act 2007. I think that my record today testifies to such independence, but I will leave that for others to judge. All I can say is that it is of the utmost importance that we have independent oversight and that this oversight is maintained. Let me now turn to the continuing problems that bedevil our prisons. Slopping out is still with us, but that is changing fast. At the end of September of this year, slopping out will be a thing of the past in Mountjoy Prison. It took 150 years to get that far, during which time inmates had to endure this inhumane and degrading treatment. A new prison is to start in Cork, and new wings are to be built in Limerick. So that will leave only one wing in Portlaoise Prison without in-cell sanitation. In my view, that's a huge step forward. Overcrowding is an international problem. We all know what that means. Drugs in prisons are also an international problem. The sale of and taking of drugs in prisons really mirrors what happens in society. Prisoners incur enormous debts for drugs that they get in prisons. In many cases, the uninvolved parents or family of a prisoner who has been supplied with drugs will have to pay, and this payment may attract a premium of up to 10 times the original value of the drugs, and the drug barons will make sure that they are paid. It is not only the poor, the uneducated, and the destitute that make money for the drug barons. Of course they contribute to it, but in most cases their contribution is financed by petty thieving. However, free society, in my view, has a part to play. Would we have such a drug problem if the drug barons were reliant only on the poor, the uneducated, and the marginalised? I say no. If those in middle-class society who live in the leafy suburbs and have good jobs and a reasonable standard of living did not engage in, and I use the word with inverted commas, recreational drug taking, the drug barons would be less powerful and the impact on prisons might well be less. Prisoners on protection are also a huge problem. A prisoner on entering prison may well have a drug debt and is afraid. He may well be a member of a particular gang, be from a particular geographic area of the country, or come from a different ethnic background. No one can say on entering prison who their friends might be. It is difficult to blame such persons for seeking the protection of the governor. However, this means that these prisoners will only receive limited out-of-cell time, have little, if any, access to education, vocational training, or even interaction with others, be they prisoners or staff. If you had a dog and kept him locked up for 23 hours a day for a year, he would likely not be the good-natured pet that he was prior to such lockup. Would you be any different if you had to suffer this for your own protection. Another problem is the culture of those who are the jailers. This has built up over the years. It is changing. However, there must be consequences for those who do not measure up in this regard. Finally, and I think this is probably the most important, there's a huge problem of prisoners with mental health problems. I just asked the question, is it fair that prisons now seem to be the only places for those who are the most vulnerable and the most marginalised in society? I say no. Let me turn briefly now to a hobby horse of mine, and that is why we need to send so many people who have been charged with minor offences to prison. Let me give you an example. If you live on Main Street and on a constant basis the windscreen wipers of your car are damaged, or you're kept awake by some drunk roaring and shouting, or you were a shopkeeper who has had to experience shoplifting, you will probably be delighted if, having rung the guards, a culprit is identified and prosecuted. You may have some passing interest if this person is brought to the court, and you may take certain satisfaction if he gets a sentence. But what does it achieve? It means that for the duration of the sentence, this particular person will be out of circulation. But what happens when he gets out of prison? What happens? The whole thing starts all over again. Would it be better to try another way? I tried another way in North Tipperary. I set up the Nina Reparation Scheme. In this scheme, offenders, if assessed as suitable, are managed in the community by the community instead of going to prison. It achieves the same result as prison, except with two significant upsides. It costs a fraction of what prison costs, and the offender learns not only how to deal with his offending ways, but learns skills to help him with his life. I've also been a huge supporter of problem-solving courts. I chaired one half of the National Crime Council. My committee produced a report which advocated the introduction of community courts in Ireland. That report is sitting gathering dust, as there are a lot of reports. But you can access that report on the National Crime Council website, and I feel that this is the way to go. I would like to talk more on this particular topic, but I'm afraid time is against me. Great strides have been made to bring the fabric of our prisons, the vocational and educational training provided, and the welfare of our prisons into the present century. No prison has done more in this regard than Mountjoy Prison, which has, over the years, attracted considerable criticism, not alone from the Irish media, but from international bodies and from me in my reports. Mountjoy was built as a model prison. I said earlier, it didn't remain a model prison for long. It lost its way, and it deserved all the criticism. But now it is fast regaining its former status, and will, I think, soon be the flagship prison in Ireland. So finally, my message is that prisoners must be treated in a humane fashion. However, there are no votes for politicians in prisons, so don't let uninformed prejudices put a brake on prison reform, because, as I have said at the outset, a country should be judged on how it treats its vulnerable people. Prisoners are our people, and they are vulnerable, and I think that this country deserves to be able to treat them properly. Thank you very much.